Hello, I'm Heather Matthews. I'm going to be your host for Safety Accountability, Mini Module 2, Accountability versus Responsibility. If you have joined this session and you have not taken Mini Module 1, I would recommend that you log back in to Mini Module 1 and take them in order. It'll be clearer that way. So for Mini Module 2, Accountability versus Responsibility, we will be covering several topics, but the main thing we're going to be covering is responsibility versus accountability. And we're also going to be talking about what is effective accountability and addressing the root cause of accountability or why accountability does not happen. So when we talk about responsibility versus accountability, responsibility is an obligation to perform duties, and it relies on your personal integrity, and it doesn't necessarily is associated with consequences. So for example, you're given a list of duties when you start a job, or you have a job description that outlines your responsibilities. Then there's another section when we talk about accountability. When we talk about the difference between accountability and responsibility, accountability requires consequences. So when you think about you have your job description and it says you're responsible for providing frontline care, or you're responsible for the maintenance in a long-term care facility, or you're responsible as an administrator, you have certain responsibilities. And there needs to be some way to measure that, and that's holding people accountable. And the accountability piece requires consequences. So for example, if you have an annual review, that's where you're held accountable, and doesn't necessarily mean in a negative way, but that's the time to check in and say what's going well, what's not going well. So if we apply these principles to health and safety, or occupational health and safety, when we talk about responsibility and accountability, how do we measure that, and how do we make sure consequences are balanced? So a perfect example of that is if you are lifting a client or a resident and you require 2 people to operate a manual lift, and somebody comes along and one person is doing this transfer and they're doing it by themselves and they don't have any help. And we talk to that person, we say, no, you're not supposed to do that, and this is the same person that, they're the go-to person, they're the one that gets me out of all of the jams when I need an extra person to work. Everybody likes them, and so we just say, don't do that, and we get them some help and we carry on. And then we go down the hall a little bit further, and somebody is doing a similar activity and is doing a manual lift with one person, and we get all upset and can't believe you're doing that, and you suspend them, and it's totally different reaction. Now, the reaction may be because you've already seen this once today, so you're getting a little frustrated, but we have to remember we have to take the personalities out of it, we have to take all of it and have to say, the appropriate consequence, and it needs to be balanced. And the other thing, too, is when we talk about consequence, it isn't always negative consequence. And when we talk about accountability and consequences, we focus on the negative. But it could be good things, too. There could be positive consequences. So we'd like to talk about that as well. So the consequences should be balanced. Someone is accountable when his or her performance is measured. So this is linking us into the KPIs that we talked about in Module 1, is how do we measure that accountability or that performance? When someone is responsible, they may or may not have their performance measured. So that's the big distinction between responsibility and accountability. And we probably, going forward, you'll probably never think about those 2 words exactly the same way, because we tend to use them interchangeably. And now that you really understand the difference between accountability and responsibility, you'll probably think about it differently. Because we say everybody's responsible for health and safety, but how are we holding them accountable to that? And the whole objective behind all of this accountability and holding people accountability, holding them accountable, is to measure their performance. Because what we want is to have people's performance measurable so we can measure how well we're doing as an organization. So when we think about what's effective accountability, so it's authorized behavior. So what's the things that are happening that are right? So these are the things we're trying to have. So it's not about, I mean, I guess if it's not authorized behaviors, but effective accountability is when you're looking at authorized behaviors, doing an objective evaluation with the appropriate consequences. So the condition of effective accountability exists when employees' authorized behavior is objectively evaluated and results in appropriate consequences. So that could be on the positive or the negative side. So when we talk about what's effective accountability, there's sort of three types of authority over work. So sometimes there's the authority over the work, so the employee over the supervisor. So that's, but sometimes in some situations, the person that's delving out the work isn't necessarily the supervisor. Sometimes it's a scheduler or some other administration person within your organization that may be actually telling you where to go and the work to do. Then you have the authority over the resources. So if you're in a facility where there's a purchasing department, you may have to go get your supplies from them. Sometimes as a supervisor, sometimes as a third party. But the authority over the employee is most likely always the supervisor. Very rarely would that be a different relationship. And the one authority that it doesn't talk about there, but you should think about, who are your sort of unspoken authority figures. So in every organization, there's a person that has a lot of authority and a lot of sway with the staff. So when you're trying to make cultural changes, who are those people that you need to engage and get involved? Because every organization has them. And hopefully those people are working in a positive way to advance health and safety in your organization. But you definitely want to know who those folks are and make sure they're involved in the process. So when we talk about, when we break out the three terms that are used there, when we talk about behavior, it's an observation of an action. It's something we do. And what we need to think about when we talk about behavior and evaluation in the same sentence, automatically we think that, yes, evaluation is a judgment, but it's not a judgment of the behavior it's a judgment of the behavior, not the person. And it's really difficult a lot of times for a lot of people to not take things personally. So when we say, you know, you're not using that lift correctly, people take it personally. Instead of, we're trying to say you're not using that lift correctly and you could get hurt yourself or the client, so let's use that in a different way. So we try to remember that it's an evaluation, it's a judgment of the behavior, not the person. And the judgment needs to be based on fact, not fiction. So it can't be hearsay. I heard that Sally in home care, she always lets the dogs out, dogs aren't allowed out. We have to know, it has to be fact. So make sure you're doing all your fact finding and make sure you have all the correct information before you start delving out consequences or making an evaluation based on false information. And then there's consequences. And I think, you know, I wish there was a different word other than consequences that more positively reflected positive and not just negative. Because usually when we say consequences, we think of only the negative. We don't think of the positive consequences. So one thing, and we'll talk about a little later, is, you know, the negative consequences, I think we're all familiar with that within all organizations. There's usually a disciplinary policy, even around safety rules that are broken. There's step-by-step on what needs to happen or not need to happen. But we don't often really focus on what are the positive consequences. So what are we doing to recognize great things that people are doing within their organizations? And, they can be very small things like a cup of coffee. It could be a piece of paper that the company or the organization does that's a recognition reward. It could be a sweatshirt. There's many different things, but it doesn't have to be a huge money. What it takes is a little bit of time for you to take the time to recognize. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a big public event either. It could be something between one worker to another worker, or an employee to a supervisor to an employee saying, hey, you know what, you're doing a great job. I'm so glad you brought that forward. So think about that. And then, we talked a little bit about the system of consequence, discipline, both negative and, discipline or positive recognition. So when we think about addressing the root cause, one of the big things, and this is the constant battle, and it's very prevalent in healthcare and community services, but I think it's fairly common in most other industries. I think this is the biggest hurdle we have to overcome in respects to workers frequently know how to work safely and at times choose not to work safely. So when I'm out there talking to people in healthcare and community services, and I ask that question, why does that happen? The most common answers I get is they're rushing, they're speed, they're taking shortcuts because they think it's quicker. And it may be quicker 9 times out of 10, but the 10th time when you get hurt and you're debilitated for months or possibly the rest of your life, how much time have you really saved? It's kind of like the same analogy as the parking ticket if you're or the speeding ticket if you're speeding. It's great, but if you get caught, I swear they keep you there a longer period of time to teach you the lesson. It's not the fine, because what motivated you was the shortcuts. So I think shortcuts is the number one reason why taking shortcuts, because we think it's faster. And even though an organization will say, I want you to take your time, I want you to do it right, many times workers get mixed messages or just are convinced that they need to do it at that speed because they look at all the things they have to do. And I say one of the things is, I know this happens a lot, in long-term care, is, if they're kind of on the schedule of other departments, for example, dietary, where, if breakfast is being served at 8:30, they have certain tasks they want done by then or by lunch, or even not even around the client or the resident's schedule, but around their own break schedule. They're trying to get certain things done before their break or their lunch. So rushing and taking shortcuts is number one. The other thing is sometimes it's a little bit of peer pressure. They know how to do it right, but everybody else does it that way, so they don't want to look like they're standing out. And then workers often see others work in an unsafe manner and choose to say nothing. So the other common feedback I get from this comment is they're afraid to say something to somebody. They're not sure that they really know the right way to do it, so they're afraid to be challenged. And that happens a lot with new graduates coming out and trying to talk to senior people that have been in the organization for many years that probably have developed some bad habits, but they're really afraid to stand up. So how do we develop a culture of being open and honest and being able to have those conversations? And the other issue is managers often fail to explore the reasons why workers don't work safely and they don't get to the root cause. So what happens is, because everybody's pressed for time, because when something happens, the manager does an investigation, but as soon as they find the first thing that went wrong, they assume that's the root cause. They really don't get down to the root cause. So far too often, they'll be interviewing the employee, and the employee will say they were rushing, they were trying to get it all done before lunch, and they'll say, blame it on the employee and they are rushing. And not looking at, well, does everybody have to be fed at lunch, or why do they think that has to be done? Why can't it be done after lunch? Like getting to what are the messages in the organization? What's the root cause? So doing a better investigation of those root causes and observing what's happening in your organization and starting to change these cultures. And when you know that, when people know they're being held accountable to a different level, that'll help create a better atmosphere for people not taking shortcuts. Because they'll say, if I take this shortcut, and someone's going to be asking. So when we look at addressing the root cause, most organizations spend time in putting all their efforts into forced compliance. So that's the safety rules, the regulations, and behaviors. And we think that they're holding them accountable, and they think that that's going to reduce incidents. So if we meet the legislation and we're holding everybody accountable to that legislation, we think that's going to reduce the incidents. But our statistics show us that that's not true. A lot of organizations are compliant within the legislation, and they still have far too many incidents. So we need to take the focus, spread the focus. We don't want to take the focus off forced compliance. That needs to happen. If you're not compliant with something, we need to make that better and make sure we're compliant with all the safety rules and regulations. But we need to look at holding people accountable. And that's where you get to the root cause, and that's where you'll start to see the reductions of incidents. Once you create the awareness and heighten the awareness, time over time we see that reduction. So that is the end of mini module 2, and this was on accountability or responsibility versus accountability. When you close out this webinar, you can complete the online form and answer the questions and submit. We will send the certificate to the address and your employer that you provide. And when you complete the questions, if you do not get 100%, it will send you back to the questions again. And once you correct the one, and once you get 100%, then you can submit it and you'll get a message that you've completed it. Thank you very much. And if you have time, you can go to the next module, which is mini module 3 under safety and accountability.